All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on Facebook and online here on Zoom for our Thursday webinar. I am Liz Perry, President and CEO of Crow Canyon, joined by board member Jim Potter, who is going to be lurking behind me periodically. So thank you so much. We'll go ahead and get started. Before we introduce our talk and our speakers, I want to go ahead and begin with our usual introductory slides. The Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Diné, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands this institution sits. Our mission-related work at Crow Canyon would not be possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future, which is something that we say each time. And more specifically, all of the work that you're going to hear about today and all of the archaeological work that we do at Crow Canyon involves the homes of the ancestors of Indigenous people in the Southwest. And we are fortunate enough to have been able to build our careers and our mission by working on those homes. In the present, our partners, our Indigenous partners, are sovereign nations that we are working on developing equal partnerships with. And the Indigenous youth of today are truly the future of archaeological practice. We respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to us as individuals, to Crow Canyon, and to their contributions to all humankind. We are grateful to all Indigenous people and support the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. This particular webinar is part of our first Thursday of each month, where we will be featuring a Crow Canyon topic, our theme and celebration of our 40 years of research, innovation, and collaboration. This year, we are releasing a new book this anniversary year titled Research, Education, and American Indian Partnerships at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. So stay tuned for that. It will be released both in a shareable digital PDF format and hard copy soon. Thank you so much to all of you, so many of you who signed up for today's webinar, made donations. We are incredibly grateful for your support. We could not do this without you. I know for all of our Zoom veterans, you are familiar with this, but when you do have questions throughout the presentation, please enter them into the Q&A as opposed to the chat. Sometimes people are actually chatting in the chat and those will get lost. But if you ask them in the Q&A, not only are you likely to get them answered live, but we have our 4 scholars here will be monitoring the Q&A and typing any answers to your questions and sharing them as well, so that if we run out of time, you've still had a chance to dialogue with our speakers. If Zoom has given you trouble, we are streaming live on Facebook, and this lecture will be available on our YouTube channel as soon as we're done. We've got some fantastic webinars coming up. We have Dr. Stephen Shackley, who will be talking about obsidian sourcing next week. And the week after that, we have our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Donna Glowacki, who will be talking about 40 years of Crow Canyon's ancestral Pueblo Community Center archaeology. We can't wait to see Donna in digital form. So without further ado, our webinar this week, How the Dolores Archaeological Program Shaped Research at Crow Canyon. Our speakers need no introduction. Doctors Ricky Lightfoot, Mark Varien, Bill Lipe, and Tim Kohler will be talking about their experiences and probably a bit about themselves as well. So I will not steal their thunder and do introductions of them, except to say thank you, all 4 of you, very much for doing this. We're very grateful here at Crow Canyon, and I know our listeners are as well. So with that, Taylor, I will turn it over to you.
Hello, this is Bill Lipe. This is Bill Lipe in the introduction to this webinar. I'll start with a map of the greater Mesa Verde region from Glen Canyon on the left there over to the Navajo Reservoir, the upper San Juan River. One of the things I tried to do here was to list some of the big projects for this region, and I was lucky to have participated in several of them. I was a graduate student when I worked for 4 summers in the Glen Canyon before Lake Powell went in. Cedar Mesa, I worked with my colleague at R.G. Matson as co-director of a survey of the, let's go next slide. Survey of the 800 square kilometers of the Cedar Mesa area, which is at the heart of the Bears Ears Monument. And I worked on the Dolores project for several years, which was a really great experience that leads into our seminar today and how the work done on the Dolores project helped shape the development of research at Crow Canyon. I have to say that I'm 88 years old and I'm still as interested in archaeology and as excited by it as I was when I started back in the late 1950s. It's a great field, and one of the things that keeps it going is that following Dave Thomas's advice, it's not what you find, it's what you find out. So in particular, the 1970s and 80s were a period of figuring out how to find this stuff out by developing better methods for understanding in detail how things worked in these communities we're studying. So let's say that these big projects help shape the course of archaeology in the southwestern Colorado and southeastern Utah, and that Crow Canyon benefited from it, and then has, after the formation of the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in the early 1980s, it has contributed to adding new ways of finding out about the most interesting past. The Dolores Archaeological Project was a result of the Bureau of Reclamation building a dam on the Dolores River about 10 miles downstream from the little town of Dolores, resulting in the formation of the McPhee Reservoir, which you see here, and the destruction of numerous sites, many of them quite large. Next slide, please. The project was designed to document and understand the archaeological sites that would be lost as a reservoir field. The contract for these studies was awarded to the University of Colorado under Dave Brenitz's direction, with Washington State University as a major subcontractor. And I was able to direct teams of WSU students who worked annually on the DAP. Next slide, please. By 1980, the Dolores project, the DAP, was arguably the largest archaeological project in the US, judged both by level of funding and by its staff size. And here on the left, you see the 1980 staff. And then in the context of downtown Dolores, Colorado, a town of about 1,000 residents, the archaeologists really played a big role in that town. And it was a good relationship. We were treated well by the people in Dolores, and I think we behaved adequately well. Next. One of the surprising aspects of the Dolores project, once work started, not much archaeological work had been done in that part of the Dolores area until the Dolores project started, was the number of really large village level sites. The previous pattern had been one more of dispersed homesteads, dry farming close to the fields. But in the 700s and 800s AD, there was a formation of people pulling together to form village-sized aggregates, some of them of several hundred people. McPhee was the largest, and you see here the pattern. The shaded in areas are room blocks of surface rooms, and then the little circles were pit structures that were in front of the surface rooms. So the surface rooms were connected to the adjacent pit structures, and Ricky Lightfoot's presentation will show what was learned about how that came about and how it worked. one of the things that's shown in this particular illustration is that one part of the McPhee complex had a layout that was like anticipating things that were happening 50 or 100 years later at Chaco Canyon. The circular arrangement of rooms and with pit structures, and then the presence of a oversized non-residential pit structure in the middle of the complex of this walled plaza complex was really striking, and gave us some insights into the patterns of leadership and religious development at McPhee. The WSU group was assigned to do excavations at one of the 6 large Dolores Valley villages, the Grass Mesa site. Fortunately, I convinced Tim Kohler, a new faculty member at WSU, to direct the Grass Mesa work while I was taking care of the overall WSU work, the overall WSU contingent. Tim's experience in quantitative methods and probabilistic sampling were major factors in his appointment. Tim influenced research planning throughout the duration of the DAP, and since then has made many contributions to Southwestern and World Archaeology, some done as a Crow Canyon Research Associate. Today, he's one of the few archaeologists who is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, which is quite a prestigious and well-earned position. The presentations by Ricky and then Mark will lead into Tim's presentation. But what we're going to do is look at Ricky will look at some of the methods for understanding the household level and village and room block level organization of life at one of the sites that was the DAP that Crow Canyon took over after the DAP, and Mark will be talking about the same level of organization at the Pueblo in the 1100s and 1200s in the Pueblo III period. Next, please. The DAP was one of the first major U.S. archaeological projects to digitize all its field and lab records. The completed forms were rigorously checked for accuracy before being downloaded. And interestingly, to show the level, the state of development we're in at this point, for the first couple of years on the DAP, data were entered on punch cards that were shipped in boxes to Denver and fit into the Bureau Rex mainframe. There for a while, the Dolores Project was one of the main users of the Bureau of Reclamation's mainframe. It served a huge area of the Western US. But after 1983, the Crow Canyon Center adopted versions of after about 1980, people on the DAP, including Rohr and Udick, were able to download much of the data directly into a computerized database. After 1983, the Crow Canyon Center adopted versions of the DAP forms that were developed for its field and lab work. These are fairly complex, but carry a lot of information if they're done correctly. So all the field workers on both of the DAP and the Crow Canyon Center have learned to fill these out fully and accurately. Next, please. Enter Stuart Strever into the picture of the late Dolores Archaeological Project. Came a archaeologist from Northwestern University named Stuart Strever. He and several influential archaeologists in the 1960s and 70s, he argued that American archaeology was not appropriately organized to meet the opportunities and demand of the current era of fast developing new methods and new research questions. he recommended long-term regionally focused research conducted by multidisciplinary teams of archaeologists and scientists, carried out in conjunction with public education programs involving K-12 students as well as adults, and based in a nonprofit organization largely supported by private funds rather than short-term federal grants. So he proposed that in the next slide, he proposed that what was called at the time the Crow Canyon School, which was run by Ed Berger on the right here, and was called the Interdisciplinary Supplemental Education Program, or ISEP, informally the Crow Canyon School. Stewart proposed that that become affiliated with the Center for American Archaeology in Illinois and become the southwestern campus of the CAA. And he had this photo, which is late 1981, or more likely early 1982. I'm on the left here, guiding Stewart here, and Ed Berger, at one of the pit excavations of Grass Mesa. The woman in the blue shirt is Catherine Bard, at the time a graduate student working for the Center for American Archaeology. She recently retired as professor of archaeology and classical studies at Boston University, so she had a long, productive career in archaeology, starting with her work with the CAA. Next, please. Additional connections between the DAP and Crow Canyon were the field school that Tim Kohler and I put on from WSU, for WSU, in the summer of 1982. This was designed to bring field school students from around the country in direct contact with the experienced field workers on the DAP. So they learned to do field archaeology and artifact analysis in the laboratories alongside experienced workers on a really major project. WSU rented the Crow Canyon facility while Ed and Joe Berger were in Illinois learning how the CAA worked in preparation for the Crow Canyon School becoming CAA Southwest Campus. Kohler and Lipe are here in the back of the list of the pack here. And this photo includes some of the DAP staff who were camping with the field school as well as the field school students. Next, please. 1983, a critical year, and the one from which we are calculating our 40th anniversary for the Crow Canyon Center's research program. Crow Canyon is now, by 1983, Crow Canyon had become the Southwest campus of the CAA. Newly hired PhDs, Chuck Adams and Bruce Bradley, had started work at the Duckfoot site and actually had begun to map the next big project, which is the large pueblo called Sand Canyon Pueblo. Adams also, by mid-year 1983, had completed a detailed plan to transform Crow Canyon into a full regional archaeological research center, responsible for lab analysis and report writing, as well as annual field work. The center has now achieved those goals of being a productive regional center capable of doing the full range of archaeological research. Center successfully achieved those goals for 40 years, and we're celebrating the anniversary of that happening currently. Next, please. Following up with here are some of the things that Liz's introduction brought to bear. By 1986, Crow Canyon had become fully independent from CAA, as Stuart Streaver became the president of the newly named Crow Canyon Archaeological Center and withdrew from his professorship at Northwestern and his previous role with CAA. It was a big change. So Crow Canyon became the focus of the primary spinoff from the CAA as the emerging research center. Although the DAP gave the Crow Canyon Center a running start in building a lasting research program, one thing it did not bequeath to Crow Canyon was regular working relationships with today's Native American communities, including those culturally related to the ancestral Pueblo sites on which most of Crow Canyon's research has been focused. The map below shows the locations of present-day pueblos here on the Rio Grande, from Taos down to Isleta. And then between the Rio Grande and the Hopi villages over here in Arizona, we have the Zuni, Yakima, and Laguna Pueblos. So these are active, vibrant Pueblo communities with a substantial interest in what archaeologists are doing with the sites where their ancestors lived. Next, please. Crow Canyon has had Native American Advisory Committee since 1995, and the center's mission statement now values American Indian knowledge along with archaeological research and experiential education. So some of the things that mark that emergence of a necessary relationship, building good relationships between the emerging Crow Canyon Archaeological Center and the Pueblo communities. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Bill. This is Tim Kohler. You're going to hear briefly from me now, and then Mark and Ricky are going to speak, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more again later. This is the McPhee Reservoir. Next slide, please. I came to the DAP through Washington State University, and I came to Washington State University fresh out of a PhD from University of Florida. And my PhD project, which was funded by a National Science Foundation grant given to my advisor, whose name was Jerry Milanish, was to do village sampling excavations at the McKeithen site. Oh, thanks, Taylor. And then over on the right, you can see a plan map that I made arduously in the mid-70s of the McKeithen site. It's got 3 mounds and a big plaza in the middle. And this site is something like 19 hectares in size, so it's very large. And I had to make this map, which I'm inordinately proud of, with a plane table and an alidade shooting through thick pine trees. Next slide, please. However, I have to admit that many years after I made that map, we got LiDAR imagery of this same site. You can still see those mounds, A, B, and C in their proper relationship, but Taylor's going to trace a faint dark line all the way around the 3 mounds, except where it's interrupted by the creek there. And I missed that entirely in my map. It was lost in the pine trees and the duff from the pine trees. And it looks like it was a sort of a low berm demarcating the sacred space, or at least semi-sacred space, in the center of this village. Thankfully, they did not revoke my PhD, so I'm here to talk with you today. Next slide, please. But the thing that was interesting about this site for me was that it was large, and there was no way I could make substantial sense of it without developing some kind of sampling approach. And it was just about this same time when new archaeology was becoming enamored of probabilistic sampling. And so I was an eager early adopter of these sampling techniques. And I put little 2x2 meter squares all over the McKeithen village and all over the plaza, and was able to make all sorts of maps of how materials were were distributed across this very large area. And then my mentor, who you see in that in the plum shirt there on the left side of this picture, Jerry Milanish, was in charge of the mound sampling excavations. Next slide. We like to play practical tricks on him when he came out. And so one of the undergraduates here is wearing a t-shirt that says, "I'm with stupid," with the arrow pointing towards him, and we're all getting a good chuckle. But Jerry has a nice sense of humor and didn't fire me and didn't hate us for the rest of our lives. Next slide, please. So that was my background when I arrived in Dolores. I arrived in WSU in the fall of '78, taught for a couple semesters, and meanwhile, Bill Lipe drafted me into the DAP, and I started down at the DAP in the summer of 1979. This is a picture of the Dolores River near the Washington State University field camp in the winter of 1979. And to you, it probably looks kind of bleak, and forbidding. But to me, I found it refreshing and invigorating, and I was happy to get out of the warmth and humidity and the bugs of North Florida. So I was ready to jump into southwestern archaeology with both feet, but I did not know very much about it, and I had to learn very fast. Okay, next slide. Here you can see, Taylor, can you outline Grass Mesa? There we're looking at Grass Mesa before the entire area, what began to be bulldozed up, and very beautiful valley there in late summer of 1979. And the Grass Mesa site is that long wedge that Taylor has just outlined. And it was a huge Pueblo I, mostly Pueblo I site. It has some early Basket Maker 3 occupation on it too, but the major occupation is from about 840 to 880 or 890. And that's right in the heart of the Pueblo I village buildup in the northern Southwest. One of my jobs, next slide, please. I was, as Bill said, I was put in charge of the nominal, at least the excavations at Grass Mesa and the surrounding locality, which was called the Grass Mesa locality. And one of the first jobs was to get things up and running at Grass Mesa. And so we had to put in a grid. We had to get rid of at least enough surface vegetation to do a surface collection. Next slide. And this next slide shows you the results of, I probably made 50 different maps of this sort showing the distribution of different kinds of materials on the surface of Grass Mesa. But Taylor right now is tracing the distribution of building stone. High densities of building stone show up as white on this map. And you can see there's an arc of room blocks on the northern side of each of those areas. And then down again, underneath that big depression there, which is a great kiva, which was a very large and imposing structure that we excavated a good deal of. And Ricky Lightfoot was responsible for writing up a nice article about that, published in the Kiva, about what an amazing thing the roof of that structure must have looked like. So anyway, once that was done, we could divide this into areas, and then we could devise a probabilistic sampling program and so forth. I don't really have time to talk too much about what exactly the probabilistic sampling brought to the DAP, but I do want to give you a few sort of overview comments, next slide, about what I think the most important contributions of the DAP were. First of all, in southwestern archaeology as a whole, really not all that much was known about Pueblo I. It was just that murky period of time before the great Pueblos appeared in Pueblo II, and between the early non-village life known as Basket Maker 3. What we know now is that those Pueblo I villages were pretty ephemeral. They lasted about a couple generations in the mid 800s, falling apart in the late 800s or very early 900s. And aggregation at the scale that we saw at Grass Mesa was quite novel in the northern Southwest at that time. And people hadn't entirely figured out how to make it work. At least that's what I think. And it caused some problems such as local depletion of wood resources. The DAP region likely hosted, and this was something we didn't actually realize too much while we were doing the excavations, although maybe some smart people did. But later on, people like Scott Ortman and Rich Wilshusen pointed to good evidence that there were probably a couple different ethno-linguistic groups, or perhaps more likely groups with somewhat different architectural traditions coming in to live in this area. The Pueblo I villages in the DAP area were occupied just as Pueblo people were starting to build great houses in Chaco Canyon. And people in the Dolores area may have started out on that same route, because Dolores villages like McPhee have room block layouts reminiscent of those at Chaco. But then the DAP area was mostly abandoned in the late 800s. So how do we read this? This is a really, I think, substantial fundamental question in southwestern archaeology. Was it a rejection of hierarchy? Or was it simply a response to the cooler and drier conditions that were making farming more difficult in the DAP area? So over the years, I've sort of come to the idea that these are really not two different explanations at all. It just sounds as though they are, because I think that systems like these Pueblo One villages fall apart, are always ready to fall apart, but they hang together so long as there's a good sense of community in the site and within the region. And if that sense of community begins to deteriorate, and that could be due to, for example, emerging hierarchy, then it's very easy for deleterious climatic conditions develop in such a way that some people decide to leave and then the whole system falls apart. Well, so that's something I've been trying to explore ever since the DAP. I want to also say, in closing of this first segment, that DAP work was made possible by large-scale computerized information systems and bolstered by some early simulation. And that combination and that scale impressed me and many others quite a bit. So I took away from the DAP that large-scale work like this was clearly a promising strategy for southwestern archaeology, and much more could be done along those lines. And eventually, with the collaboration of Crow Canyon, that led to the Village Ecodynamics Project, which I'll talk about when you hear from me again. Thanks.
Okay, I think I'm live now. So Tim came to the Dolores Archaeological Program from the area of Florida, and I came from Texas by way of Alaska, where also conditions were extremely different. This is our crew working on an excavation site in Southeast Alaska, and this was pretty much our everyday apparel. So I'd been working for several years doing contract archaeology and made my decision to go back to graduate school. Next slide, please. So I entered the graduate program in 1979, and next slide, please, at WSU. And then that summer, Bill hired me to work for WSU at the DAP project. And I was hired on as an assistant crew chief first. And on my first day of work, I was assigned to work with that lovely young woman in the red dress, in the red shirt there. And I thought she was quite a nice person, and 43 years later, we're still together. So next slide, please. That was a lucky day for me. I was also a part of that crew, the field school crew who lived at Crow Canyon in 1982, and I lived in a tent where the archaeological laboratory is now situated. Next slide, please. So in 1983, the transformation began, as Bill mentioned, with the building of the lodge. But if you look closely, you'll see that the lodge was built to attach to the old architecture of the pre-1983. So it was simply adding on to the facilities there. But other changes were happening. The construction of the new lodge provided better housing for the students and a proper kitchen and dining room for larger groups of people. But Crow Canyon, as Bill mentioned, had hired 2 PhD archaeologists. They developed a multi-year research design, and they launched education programs in 1983 that attracted people from all over the country and started attracting school groups also from all across the country. Next slide. But it didn't happen all at once. As you might imagine, there was still much of the old architecture. So the building in the top left there is, at the time that I arrived, that was the archaeological laboratory. And we washed the artifacts with garden hoses out on that back porch there that you see. We also still had some teepees for overflow housing for students. And the newest buildings were, besides the lodge, were highway department trailers that had been salvaged and put in place and lined with wood siding to give it a historic fort looking effect. Next slide. Then in 1986, there were 10 new hogans that also provided housing for adult program participants. And that's also the year that Bill Lipe became the research director at Crow Canyon. and he began to rapidly expand the research program to be a very multifaceted approach that involved at first archaeological surveys as well as excavations at two sites simultaneously. Soon after, he was able to launch an environmental archaeology program and hire staff to do environmental studies and just analyze the plant remains from the sites we were studying. So it was really living up to that idea of doing archaeology as a collaborative effort between archaeologists and scientists. Next slide. So this is the campus in 1987. The new archaeological laboratory building, the Gates building, was provided the laboratories, offices, classrooms, temporary curation facilities. So it was a wonderful addition, and you can see the Hogans in the background. So that was the campus in 1980. Well, really for the first time, fully equipped to take on the kind of multifaceted science and research projects that we were involved in. Next slide. So the Duckfoot site, as has been mentioned in this presentation, was began in 1983, the year before I arrived and started working. So in 1984, I began to take over the leadership role at the excavations at Duckfoot and continued until 1987. Meanwhile, Chuck Adams and Bruce had moved on to the Sand Canyon Pueblo excavations, and Bill Lipe replaced Chuck Adams as the research director. Next slide. So the DAP to Crow Canyon transition for the people who were involved was one that working on projects with very different goals and very different tool sets. The DAP was a salvage project, which meant that anything that we failed to discover or to study was going to be destroyed by the construction of the dam and by the rising waters of the dam and so forth. So there was an urgency to move as quickly as we could, not to do a sloppy job, but to use the largest tool that would get the job done. So often we were using heavy equipment to remove overburden so that we could get down to the archaeological deposits that were of most interest. Next slide. Very different to that were the excavations at Crow Canyon, where the sites we were studying were not threatened by bulldozers and construction. And the techniques that we were teaching were the use of hand tools, trowels, whisk brooms, dustpans, buckets. So there was no large scale removal. First of all, there wasn't much overburden because this site was up on the top of a ridge, but you can see the work was progressing at a much different scale, and often with a handful of supervisors overseeing the work of generally 20 people at a time on the site. Next slide. So one of the things that right off the bat happened was the recording forms, definition codes, the way we recorded things in the field was adopted directly from the DAP, and also the DAP information systems were miles ahead of us, and the IT people there were writing database software to manage and understand that the data that they were accumulating long before the age of personal computers. No one had a computer on their desk at work, and so the project was really progressive there, and so it was very wise of the Crow Canyon archaeologist in 1983 to adopt that system. But it was a complicated system, as Bill said. It had been developed and refined over years at the DAP. And as more people from the DAP with DAP backgrounds were hired by Crow Canyon, then more and more of that got sort of put in place in a way that would have been consistent with the way it was being done at DAP. So I think Bill's characterization of DAP giving the Crow Canyon research a running start is a good metaphor for it. Next slide. DAP focused on what we called then and still the pit house to Pueblo transition, not by choice, but by the fact that that's when the majority of the sites were being settled. So over the course of the project, over 1,000 sites were recorded, and more than 100 of those were studied through excavation, mostly only small scale excavations, probabilistic sampling. Some were studied more intensively, but overall it gives you a sense of, the goal of those kinds of projects is to learn as much about the diversity of deposits as you could in the window of time and with the amount of money that you had to work with. So that the sites in the DAP were predominantly from the Basket Maker 3 and Pueblo 1 periods, and that's when the transition from living in pit houses to living in pueblos, which included above ground contiguous rooms as well as deeper pit houses than had been occupied during the Basket Maker times. So that Basket Maker time was when maize farmers first settled in the Mesa Verde region, and they and others who were already living here adopted corn farming, and they were living in a homesteader kind of a arrangement with single family pit houses being dispersed across the landscape. So it's a story of kind of single family farmsteads. But 250 years later, the Puebloan farmers were aggregated into hamlets and villages composed of multiple family residences and consisting of contiguous above ground rooms and these much deeper pit houses. Next slide. So the Duckwood site was exactly contemporary with the peak population at the Dolores project area. And among the reasons that the site was chosen was, first of all, it was convenient because it was only about a mile from campus, so it made it easy for people to go back and forth from the campus. They also recognized that it was well preserved because it was in an area that had never been farmed in modern times, so plows had never raked across it. You could still see the tops of stones that were upright slabs at the base of the walls were still visible above the modern ground surface. And it wasn't in an area where it was either being strongly eroded or buried by other deposits. It was in a really stable location on the landscape. Its contemporaneity with the peak population in the Dolores project area also allowed the opportunity to compare and advance the models that DAP had researchers had studied. So next slide. So we sometimes recognize that certain sites represent a strong archaeological case, meaning that they have attributes that allow them to be exceptionally valuable in terms of learning about the past. As Bill said, it's not what you find, it's what you find out. And there are some sites where that can be more productive than in others. So first was this idea of its state of preservation. Also contributing to it being such a strong archaeological case was the fact that many of the structure roofs had burned and collapsed, which by that action sealed whatever was left on the floor at the time that people moved out of that structure. Also, what I mentioned, the fact that we dug the entire site, but with hand tools, and all of the excavated deposits were screened through 1/4-inch mesh screens, meant that we had a really good quality control in terms of what we were gathering. And also those burning of the roofs, if we go back just a moment, the burning of the roofs led to a almost unprecedented, the Duckwood site is one of the best dated, certainly the best dated small sites in the Southwest. We had 375 tree ring dates, and 194 of those are cutting dates, which means that those dates can be safely interpreted as representing the year that the tree died. And in many cases, when you have many trees that happen to die all at the same time, it was because people were cutting them down to do the construction. So it's an indirect link between the death of a tree and the building of a structure, but with enough dates, you can really make strong arguments about not only the dates of the site itself as a whole, but of individual structures within the site. And then the last thing is that the site itself was occupied very briefly, which meant only about one generation, which meant that a long occupation afterward didn't make the scene murky with, new pits being excavated and new trash being deposited in other pits. So the site was relatively pristine from a point of view of being briefly occupied, and it was all apparently abandoned at the same time. Okay, next. So this shows a picture of the architectural units, the rooms in rows of in the room block at the top of the slide, and always more or less to the north. And those are typically the areas that are storage rooms, and the living rooms are the ones, the somewhat larger rooms in the next tier to the south. There's a courtyard area between the room block and the pit houses. And in this case, there were four pit houses, three sort of normal size and one very small. And then down to the southern part of the map, you see the grid squares represents the excavation units, and the line, the squiggly line that goes around that was based on a projection of the edge of the midden, which was based on the density of the sites of the artifacts within the squares that were excavated. So you can see that there's a little bit of the midden that didn't get excavated, but we knew from the drop off in the abundance of artifacts that we were very close. And so we more or less were able to treat the site as if it were fully excavated. Next slide. So this is a photograph in 1984 of the excavations. The room block now rotated to the left. So the storage rooms on the far left, the living rooms kind of with more poorly preserved walls in the middle of the photograph, and then the two pit houses, pit house 1 and pit house 2 on the right. So this just gives you a kind of a scene from the air, at least, of what it looks like. Next slide, please. And then I just want to close with this, that pit house number 4 that I pointed out there kind of didn't fit with the pattern. And I'll speak about what that pattern is a little bit more in the next part of my presentation, but that was not discovered until 1 month before the end of a 5-year project. So we knew we didn't want to leave it unexcavated, because our ambition was to have a sample that represented a fully excavated site. So by that time, Mark Varien was working with me, and we kind of swung into gear. It was October, the weather was getting cold and dreary, and the success of that connection to that beautiful woman in the red shirt led to the beautiful young girl in the red hat. So she was helping me that day because Dad needed to babysit. Next slide, please. So there were a couple of themes in the research at Crow Canyon. One was site formation processes. Stuart Strieber and a group of other archaeologists who were the kind of promoters of this idea of the new archaeology and taking on more studies of the relationship of humans with their natural environment and understanding the processes whereby culture exists in a natural landscape. Was also associated with the development by Mike Schiffer at the University of Arizona, very detailed studies of the site formation processes, which were the natural and cultural events that took place, which caused the site deposits to be the way they were. So it's the activities of people that left traces, and it's the falling down of structures, the wind and the water and the rodents and the roots and all those things were a part of what had to be taken into account. And it's also was a recognition that to understand those, especially those abandonment contexts, to recognize that people didn't just vanish, that an abandonment of a settlement is not an event, but it's something that takes place over a period of time. So trying to understand those processes better was a part of the goal, with the purpose of being better able to interpret the activities and social organization within the Pueblo, having a better understanding of how those deposits came to exist. So households are defined on the basis of activities and behavior, such as co-residence and shared domestic functions, which is distinct from families. In other words, we can't see family relationships in the archaeological record, but we can see activities based on the remains that are left behind. And so the organizations of household organization is often inferred from architectural patterns, because they're often the easiest to see from the modern surface and from fairly cursory studies. Next slide, please. The Duckfoot site, because of that completeness and the all the reasons that I told you about the strong archaeological case gave us an opportunity to evaluate the models that were out there for household organization. And this is just a simplified version of one segment of a nested hierarchy model of social organization in these Pueblo I settlements. This is the basic model that the DAP followed in helping to understand the household social groups within these settlements in the Dolores Project area. So the idea of it being nested is that each of the lower order social groups is nested within higher social groups. So as you continue to expand that out, this would be an example of something similar in a simplified form to Duckfoot. That would be a hamlet size, but then you would have clusters of room block clusters, and you'd have villages, and you'd have communities, and at each scale those are nested within that. But at Duckfoot, I was primarily interested in this single site, attributes of the hierarchy model. And so next slide, please. At Duckfoot, based on architecture alone, as we were excavating, we could see the relationships of the walls, how the walls were built, how they connected to each other, and how those rooms related spatially to the pit houses. And so we were able to interpret in traditional fashion this assessment of there being 3 pit structures, which we knew about for most of the time, and these 3 suites of rooms, which clearly had been built to be associated with those pit houses. Next slide, please. So at Duckfoot, we were able to go well beyond what was done at the DAP. And one of the things that I did to better understand the assemblage of artifacts was to analyze the circumference and the arc of every rim sherd from the midden. And that gave us an ability to estimate the total number of pottery vessels from the site, in this case, from the Duckfoot site, by size and type. So we knew if it was a grayware or a whiteware. We could tell if it was a large cooking pot or a medium cooking pot or a small pot, and so forth. We used those to estimate the total pottery vessel discard in the midden, and then from that we could calculate annual discard rates. We used a total discard assemblage of pottery vessels to essentially simulate what a typical assemblage of pottery in a household might look like. So we basically reconstructed the discard to an extent that we believe that allows us to simulate what we might expect to find in these structures at the time they were abandoned, and then we could analyze whether or not the assemblages in the structures were enhanced or depleted. These kinds of studies and the results at Duckfoot were to become very instrumental in future studies by Crow Canyon researchers. Next slide. So from that work, I proposed an alternative model of household organization that was different from DAP. The DAP model, as you saw in there on that simplified model, interpreted that each dwelling unit was the locus of the residence of a nuclear family household. So even though I'm using the term nuclear family household, I can't tell what the relationships are. We know that there are, people there are dyadic pairs, people who get together and they have children, and then they have children. And so these relationships exist. So the Dolores model was that these nuclear family households were residing in one habitation room, and that they had some storage rooms that were associated with their habitation, and that multiple 2 or 3 or more of these domestic unit suites were grouped together, and those households would share the use of the courtyard and the pit house. Based on the studies that I did at Duckfoot, I sort of changed that to say that in order to have the entire suite of activities that one would need in a household, which included the production and farming and the preparation of food and the storage and so forth, that you really had to have that entire group, so that more likely the architectural suite, which included rooms and pit structures, was the locus of an extended family household. Next slide, please. So in this model, I've tried to characterize that this was what I believe was the architectural expression of a single extended family household, and that these were the kind of essential building blocks of the society. And if you think about that, then if we use the same term household to refer to one of these, 8 or so front rooms, and we multiply that time an estimate of the number of people per household, we're going to get a much larger estimate of the number of the population size than if you took each of these architectural suites as representing one household. So it has very significant implications for population estimates, depending on how you define what is the architectural expression of a household. Next slide. So the pit house to Pueblo transition was not necessarily reflective of a change in household organizations. And I suspect that in these farmsteads, if you will, people who are living in pit houses like the one on the left, which are generally much larger than the Pueblo I period pit houses, that they probably were individual extended families that were several generations of people that were sharing these structures, sharing the storage of food, sharing and cooking, farming, and so forth. So when the Pueblo I came, I believe that these suites, architectural suites, were kind of a growth right out of the basket maker period, and that the architectural expression changed, but that the extended family had long been the model by which people were living. Next slide, please. So out of this research came 2 volumes that were published as a part of the occasional papers of the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, which incidentally was a series that Bill Lipe started during his tenure as the director of research. In addition, there were numerous journal articles and presentations at professional meetings. Next slide. And with that, I hand it over to Mark Varien.
Well, great. Thank you, Bill, Tim, and Ricky, and thanks for everybody who's still hanging in there, which is most everybody. I came to the Dolores Archaeological Project in 1979, and this is just a group of us I think on a Friday at the end of the workday. I'm the second from the left on the bottom row, but there are several other people. Many people who worked on the DAP came to work at Crow Canyon, and several of those folks are in this picture. On the back row, the person second from the left with the visor on is Richard Wilshusen. Richard, Ricky, and I actually went to our first field school together in East Texas in 1976. And Richard and I both came up to work on the DAP in 1979. And Richard became the director of research at Crow Canyon in the mid 1990s. In the bottom row, about in the center, there's a person with a bandana on and a beard. That's Roger Walkenhorst. He was actually, I think, in an earlier slide that Ricky showed, because he worked on the same crew in Alaska as Ricky did when he did archaeology up there. And he served as an educator at Crow Canyon for a time being. In the upper right-hand corner, the person whose head is the highest is Neil Morris. He was the assistant crew. He also came up from Texas with the rest of this big bunch of us that were lucky enough to get jobs from Texas who got jobs on the DAP. And Neil was the assistant crew chief on the first site I worked on, the Trace Bobos site, which I'll talk more about in a minute. The cowboy in the center of the photograph with no shirt on and the cowboy hat, that's Joel Brisbane, who actually grew up in Dolores, Colorado, and he started on the DAP in 1978, a year earlier, and he was the crew chief on this site, Trace Bobos, that I'll talk about in a minute. So next slide. So there's a picture of the river valley that you sort of saw earlier. I believe Richard Wilshusen took this picture, and I think Richard's tuned into this. So thank you, Richard. He sent me several of the slides that I'm going to show you. On the right is a map of some of the villages, and I threw Trace Bobos in there. That's the first site I'll talk about. It's down in the lower left-hand corner. Then where those buildings are in the center of that picture on the left, that's the old Perriman house, which was built in the early 1900s. And there was a P1 hamlet about the size of Duckfoot in the driveway of that house. And that was the second site that I worked on. And Richard was the crew chief on that site. Then if you look to the right of it, I'm going to be talking about a village called Rio Vista. That Richard Wilshues, and again was the crew chief on, and that was my first promotion from dig bum to assistant crew chief. I was Richard's assistant crew chief on that site. And then if you look in the picture on the left, you see that white band of cliffs, the lower white band. The top of that white band is where Grass Mesa Village is located, the village that both Bill and Tim mentioned. And Bill Lipe hired me to be a crew chief for the last 2 seasons of work at Grass Mesa Village. Next slide. So here's Trace Bobos, and there's an important DAP Crow Canyon connection for me that came from this site. And that is that we implemented a probabilistic random sample on this site. And that was a part of the DAP that Tim initiated. He met a bit of resistance from some of the excavators on the DAP about digging randomly located squares as opposed to just digging in structures. So what we did at this site is we first dug the probability sample, and I believe some of those squares you can see, like the one right under where Midden is labeled, were the probability sample. And then we came in, after we finished that sample, we came in with a road grader and took off the plow zone. And what that did, you get down to this red dirt that was the dirt that was there before the people back in the mid AD 600s built this site. That dirt was there before when they got there. And everywhere they dug a feature into that red dirt, it fills in with a different color of dirt. And that's how we as archaeologists locate the pit house and the storage rooms and other pit features like Harse. So you can see some of those storage rooms are excavated, some are partially excavated, and you can see what I'm talking about there. So yeah, Duckfoot was occupied in the mid 600s. And this probability sample made a big impression on me. And I could see where it was important because it gave you a representative sample of artifacts from the whole site. Whereas if you just dug in structures, that sample of artifacts might be skewed. But also the random sample where we just drew a boundary around the whole outside of the site and then picked the squares randomly. The squares had a lot of variation between them. Some landed in the midden that had lots of artifacts, some on the periphery of the site that had very few to almost no artifacts. So when you use the random sample to statistically estimate what you would find if you dug the entire site, the variation, the confidence interval was really wide because there was so much variation between the different sampling units. So next slide, sorry, not, which is also the next site. This is a map of the Rio Vista village, which we called the trailer site at the time because a woman had been living in a mobile home trailer up there before we started working on the site. And Richard was the crew chief for excavating Area 3, which is circled on this site, and I was Richard's assistant. Next slide. We had a remarkable crew, which is shown in the picture on the left, just some of the crew. I could tell some great stories about that photograph, but I don't have time, especially about the person in the middle facing the camera, Doug Kellogg. He's got his tricorder out, figuring out something about the site. And there's a picture of the excavated room block. So next slide. So both Richard and I had experienced the probability sampling at earlier sites. And at Area 3, we wanted to create a new way of setting up that random sample. It's called a stratified random sample. And what we did is we mapped the site in great detail before we started excavating and before we selected our random squares. And rather than just selecting them randomly within the site boundaries, we divided the site into sampling stratum. And so the room block became one sampling stratum, the courtyard, another sampling stratum, the pit structures, another sampling stratum, the north periphery, another sampling stratum, and the south periphery, another sampling stratum. So we sampled both at the whole site level, but then within each of those sampling strata, and it produced estimates, population estimates of what we would have found had we dug the entire site that were much more precise. Incredible act of serendipity. One of the main books that had come out on sampling and archaeology is that one on the right by James Mueller. And he visited the site as we were devising this sample, and we got to visit with him about this idea of doing this kind of sample as Rich and I were coming up with it and laying it out. Next slide. So the connection is that is the sampling strategy I used when I came to run what was called the Sand Canyon Archaeological Project Site Testing Program, which went from 1988 to 1991. I actually came to Crow Canyon in 1987 to help Ricky finish the Duckfoot excavations. But I was also hired with the understanding that I was going to create the research design for, or work on the research design and direct the excavations for this new Crow Canyon project called the Site Testing Program. The map on the left shows the 13 sites that we tested as a part of this program. That excavations lasted for 4 years. 10 of those sites were in Upper Sand Canyon, and they were surrounding Sand Canyon Pueblo, which was the other project that Crow Canyon was excavating, and the site that Crow Canyon worked on the longest in our history. There were also 3 sites that we worked on that were in Lower Sand Canyon, Castle Rock Pueblo, Saddlehorn Hamlet, and Mad Dog Tower. Next slide. So the sites included, they were habitation sites, and they were in both mesa top settings, which you see on the left, and in canyon settings. And the slide on the left, it's hard to see, but that's at the edge of a field that had been left fallow for many years. It was in a government program called the Crop Withdrawal Program and wasn't being farmed anymore. But if you know what you're looking at, you can sort of see the rubble mound. We were selecting sites based on the survey project that Bill coordinated, and that Mike Adler, Rich Wilshues, and Carla Van West were the crew chiefs on. And it surveyed the whole area around Sand Canyon and Goodman Point Pueblos and recorded somewhere close to 500 sites in that area. And the sites that we picked for the testing program came from those that they identified on survey. And we picked sites that had the same kind of pottery that was on Sand Canyon Pueblo, which is the last pottery produced in this area. And so it was mostly defined by the presence of Mesa Verde black on white pottery, the last decorated whiteware. So the pottery would say that these sites would be contemporary with Sand Canyon Pueblo, but the 4 previous years of excavation at Sand Canyon, we were getting tree ring dates back, and that Mesa Verde black on white period is about 1180 to 1280. But we were learning from the tree ring dates that Sand Canyon Pueblo was much shorter, more like 1240 to 1280. So we really didn't know the relationship between Sand Canyon Pueblo and these surrounding small sites that had the same pottery. And that was one of the primary research goals of the testing program, was to better understand not just Sand Canyon Pueblo, but the larger community that it was the community center for. So next slide. So we implemented stratified random sampling. We mapped the sites. You can see a site map on the left. We mapped the surface remains. So we figured out the rubble where the room block was, the depression that you could see, a very slight depression on the surface that told us where the pit structure or kiva was. Often these sites had a tower and you could see the rubble for it. You could define a courtyard. You could define the area, a mounded area that had the highest artifact density that we called the midden, and then we could define the periphery of the sites. And just as we did at Rio Vista Village, we selected our random squares for excavation from each of those sampling strata. And it produced probably about as precise as estimates as you can get from a random sample when you use the amount you excavated to try and estimate what you would have found had you excavated the entire site. We excavated these sites a little less than 1% of these sites. And another thing that really influenced me in using this sampling strategy was two important articles that Bill Lipe had published. And the first one was called Preservation Archaeology, which advocated for creating samples that targeted specifically the material you needed to answer your questions, but left as much of the site as possible for the future. And the second article he wrote was In Defense of Digging, which talked about why excavation was a critical part of the dynamic of research archaeology and continuing to learn things from the past from an anthropological perspective. So next slide. So we actually, even though we excavated 1%, we were able to figure out really detailed understandings of these sites, including the architectural and the layout of the site. Because we stratified the samples, we got in the areas where it was most likely to recover tree ring dates. So we dated most of these sites with tree ring dates. And what we found from that was that the mesa top sites were earlier than San Canyon Pueblo. They were occupied in the first half of the Mesa Verde phase, and that almost all of the timbers from the structures had been removed from the sites. So from that, we inferred that the families or households that lived at these sites were actually the people that moved in and constructed San Canyon Pueblo when it was first built. On the other hand, the canyon-oriented sites were all contemporary with San Canyon Pueblo. So we really did a more refined dating of that big change in settlement patterns of moving off of the mesa tops, where most of the sites had been located for 600 years, and into canyon settings, which characterizes the final decades and century of Pueblo occupation in the Mesa Verde region. Next slide. So the main objective of the testing program was to better understand that larger Sand Canyon community. And this is another, thing that Bill did when he was director of research, was to move beyond wanting to figure out individual sites to figure out how those sites group together into larger communities, and then how neighboring communities interacted with each other. And that was a big focus of the Sand Canyon Archaeological Project. I realized by the time I finished this that it was an incredible project, the testing program. And Sandy Thompson, who was the executive director at Crow Canyon, really encouraged me to go back to school to get my PhD using the testing program as the basis for that PhD dissertation. And Crow Canyon supported me. They paid me half time while I was taking classes and going to school. So I already had a master's from the University of Texas, but I would have never gone back to get a PhD if I hadn't had that support. So I'm really grateful for that. And that dissertation wanted to expand what the testing program could teach us about the organization of these Pueblo communities. And one of the hot research topics at the time was Southwest archaeologists were questioning how sedentary Southwest Pueblo farmers were. There was the accepted wisdom in archaeology around the world is once people turned into farmers, they became sedentary. But in the 1970s, Southwestern archaeologists questioned that and started arguing that these Southwest farmers actually moved all the time. And so they came up with a notion of short-term sedentism. And I really wasn't seeing that at the sites I tested, because not only did those sites, especially the Mesa Top sites, have Mesa Verde phase occupations, they had earlier Pueblo II occupations right underneath them. And there was no stratigraphic evidence for a break in those occupations. So next slide. I wanted to use the testing program probability sample to figure out a way to measure how long Pueblo families and households lived in their homes. So what I did is piggyback on Ricky's work at Duckfoot, and I created a accumulation rate for the grams of cooking pot sherds that accumulated every year at these sites. Then I used the probability sample at both the Dolores, some of the Dolores sites and the Sand Canyon Testing Program sites to statistically estimate how many cooking pot sherds were on the entire site. Based on the 1% excavations, estimate how many cooking pot sherd, grams of cooking pot sherds if you had excavated 100% of the site. And that plot on the left shows those estimates for a number of sites. Each one of those is a site going along the bottom axis, and then the vertical axis is the occupation span in years. The site on the far left, the shortest occupation span, is actually Tres Bobos. It's from the probability sample at Tres Bobos, and the point estimate for that was an 8-year occupation. Then we get up to a bunch of sites that were occupied about the same as Duckfoot, and like Duckfoot, they're lived in for about 20 to 25 years, or a generation. And then there's a change in Pueblo architecture that happens about AD 1080, and the architecture shifts from predominantly earthen buildings to full height masonry buildings. And at the same time as that transition, you see that increase in the occupation span, and it increases to many of the Pueblo sites that we tested on the Sand Canyon Testing Program to having occupations that were as long as 80 years. And maybe even longer based on the variation in those point estimates. So the graph on the right compresses the individual sites on the left to show you that pattern over time of increasing occupation, length of occupation, and increasing sedentism. Next slide. I also wanted to expand beyond that question to ask about not just how long individual families lived in their homes, but how long did communities persist? And with this, I built on work that Bill Lipe and Steve Lexon initiated, where they did an inventory of all the large villages or sites we call community centers. We did it for the Mesa Verde region, but they gathered other archaeologists together from the whole Southwest to do it from the entire Southwest for the AD 1150 to 1300 period. Next slide. So I expanded on that work, and we built a database of all of the largest sites in the Mesa Verde region that we call community centers or villages, the white dots in this slide. Next slide. And what I did was divide those into time periods. The first time period was the 900s to the early 1000s, then 1050 to 1150, 1150 to 1225, and then 1225 to 1300, 4 different periods. A colleague, graduate student friend of mine at Arizona State University helped me create what's called a friction surface, where I wanted to look at catchments around each community center. A 2-kilometer catchment, which would be the face-to-face community, a 7-kilometer catchment, which we called a sustainable community. It was actually Nancy Mahoney that came up with that concept. And then an 18-kilometer catchment, which would be more of a resource community. So you see those circles around the white dots, and those are those catchments. But the friction surface let me look at how walking over that terrain influenced where those catchment boundaries were. So it actually takes, these catchment boundaries are actually the walking distance out from the community centers. And then the white dash lines are the boundaries between the different communities. Next slide. So what I was able to do is look at the communities where the community centers moved very short distances between those 4 periods. And for me, I interpreted those as persistent communities that weren't abandoned over that time. And this shows the distribution of these persistent communities throughout the community centers, with the 2 and 7-kilometer catchments around them, and then the larger boundaries around the groups of persistent communities. So the end product of all of this is that, yes, households moved relatively frequently, although they became more sedentary over time. But households were moving, while households were moving more frequently, these communities persisted for centuries, 3 and sometimes even close to 4 centuries. So that when households did move, they were moving in a social landscape that was defined by these persistent communities. So that is my connection between the DAP and the research I did as a part of the Sand Canyon testing program at Crow Canyon. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. I'll take it back and I will try to bring this to a close. And I am cognizant of the fact that we're running a little bit long, so I'll go as fast as I can. Here's a slide. The picture in the background here is what Crow Canyon looks like more or less today. And I think you can see what a contrast it is with the pictures that Ricky was showing you in his presentation. Anyway, what Ricky and Mark have talked about was what was happening in the mid to late 80s and the early 90s and on into the 90s at Crow Canyon. I wasn't terribly involved with Crow Canyon at that time. I was busy doing excavations at Bandelier National Monument down in the northern Rio Grande area and taking on graduate students at WSU. And one of the graduate students who came up to work with Bill and with me was Carla Van West. Next slide, please. And you've already been introduced to Carla, who's up here on this slide, because Mark mentioned that she was one of the people who was directing the survey around Sand Canyon Pueblo. So Carla came up with a very innovative dissertation project, building on some work that had been done somewhat earlier at University of Arizona by somebody named Barney Burns. And Carla made a way, building on Barney's work, to estimate the amount of maize that could be produced in any small unit of this area up around the Dolores Archaeological Project area, an area comprised of, if I remember properly, 12 7.5-minute topo quads. So next slide. This work was eventually published in her dissertation jointly by Crow Canyon and WSU. And it was my pleasure to chair that dissertation. And I realized that what she had done, which was to marry a spatial distributional approach, which was made possible by geographic information systems with amounts of production, made it possible to examine all sorts of processes on these landscapes. Next slide. Carla and I were invited in about 1992 to give a talk at the newly emerging Center for Complex Systems in Santa Fe that was called the Santa Fe Institute. And one of the people who heard my talk there was Chris Langton. And Chris was just at that time, next slide, developing a simulation program called SWARM, which was an agent-based modeling program. And in just a second, you'll see what that is. And so what we tried to do with Carla's work was to put agents onto the resource landscapes that she had made with her GIS work. Next slide. And they so the little red dots here are households moving around on this landscape. And we have, although you can only see the deer represented here, where you have bright green, you have many deer. Where you have black, you have no deer, and intermediate greens are areas in between. And you can see there's a graph there showing the number of deer on the landscape. But households are moving around on this landscape in conjunction with rules that we provided. And then, of course, these households form settlement patterns, and we can compare the settlement patterns that they form when we change the rules that they're following. And so that's a way to make progress on the interesting question as to what rules were these people following when they built a settlement here rather than there. Okay, next slide. area that we were working on with those simulations was the area that came to be called VEP1 in this slide here. That stands for Village Ecodynamics Project 1. And so armed with the great sort of empirical work that Mark and Ricky have talked about at Crow Canyon, and then joining that to this modeling work that I was exposed to at the Santa Fe Institute, Mark and I and some others proposed to National Science Foundation a 5-year project to model, but also to empirically reconstruct the numbers of households on the VEP1 landscape. Next slide. And I'll show you those in just a minute, but to foreshadow, in about 6 or 7 years after that, we were able to extend that area to a larger space called the VEP2 North area, which is a significant subset of the area that archaeologists refer to as the Central Mesa Verde Project. Next slide. And we were also able to add this southern area that we call VEP2 South, which is a big chunk of the northern Rio Grande area. So this project altogether, the VEP, if you look at phase 1 and phase 2, lasted something like 15 years. And so we were able to do a whole lot of interesting archaeology as a result of that. On the empirical side, next slide, we were able to reconstruct, advance, the distribution of households in the VEP2 North area. And it's that red line you see going up right there. You can see there's 2 very clear, well, maybe even 3 peaks on that histogram. And the first one is the buildup of the Pueblo I villages in the mid-800s. Then you go on up to the right and you see the buildup of the Pueblo II and the Chaco-related villages. And then finally, there was a lot of immigration into this area in the mid-1200s, especially from about 1225 to 1250 or 60. And that's the third final peak there. The next slide, advance. And here you see, by contrast, what's going on in the northern Rio Grande. And I have to say, I'm making this all sound really easy, but a lot of people worked on both of these things for a long time. And we used a large variety of data and had a big database to make this work. And I particularly want to call out the contribution of Scott Ortman to this work, but many other people were involved as well. What's interesting here is the northern Rio Grande begins to build up in the 1200s, just as the northern area is starting to decline in population. And what's incredible to me, given the vagaries of the archaeological record, is that the peak population in the southern research area was essentially the same or just a little bit larger than the peak population in the northern research area. And this is one of many arguments that we made, and Scott Ortman was in the forefront of making these arguments, that the northern Rio Grande area was populated, perhaps not entirely, but largely by people coming in from the Central Mesa Verde area. This is that's oversimplifying the picture just a little bit, but at first blush, that's kind of how things look. Next slide. So the period from about 2005 to 2015 was a period of very rapid publication for VEP results. Next slide, and you can just hit advance 2 or 3 times. Contributions by Scott, by Mark, by me, keep going. Books that laid out how the simulation worked. Next slide. Books that talked about the depopulation of the northern Southwest in the 1200s. And all that was came in rapid fire succession. And around 2015, 2016, something like that, we more or less ran out of money from NSF, but there were still a group of very talented graduate students here and there, and especially here at WSU, that were working on VEP related projects. And I want to highlight 3 of their contributions. Next slide. The first of those is by Kyle Bosinski, who's well known to people who've been around Crow Canyon for a while because he did work there for a few years before going up to University of Montana, where he is now. One of his contributions and part of his dissertation was to expand yet again the area that we were modeling agricultural production for, to include that entire area within that dotted line right there that's called the study area on the right-hand picture. And that includes basically the entire US Southwest. And what's shown as a dark green in this are those areas in which, on average, year after year from AD 500 to 1400, those areas are in the dry farming niche, meaning they get enough precipitation and are warm enough to do dry farming. That doesn't mean that people were farming there. And oh, by the way, that logic doesn't really work for areas outside of that dotted line. So just look at the area inside the dotted line. The white areas, on the other hand, are areas that are either too dry, which is normally the case for most of these areas, but you can also see a few areas, if you know the topography, that were too high and were too cold. So the areas that are dark green are in that sweet spot. And this is figured out every year, and this is done from tree rings. And if you want to know details, please read that wonderful article by Kyle that is called out there. Next slide. So go ahead and hit advance. We can look at how this works. So this is just that same area that was in the dotted line beginning in AD 500. And what's high and dark here is are areas that for in the current year and the last 3 years have been in the dry farming niche. And what's light gray and flat and low in elevation, this is pseudo elevation, are areas that are outside of the dry farming niche. And you can see that this is moving around a lot. You can go ahead and advance. We're not going to watch this whole thing, but the important thing is that, oops, okay, that's fine. The important thing is that it's a hard landscape to live on, and it's in a way not surprising that people began to, how come the right-hand simulation isn't working? Yeah, good, thanks. And so, what I'd like you to take from that is that the folks who were living on this landscape were very clever, but that also there were some places that were, yeah, you could just keep those simulations running, Taylor, it's fine, both of them. There were some places that were better than others. And if people began to get more sedentary, they could perhaps begin to transmit those more desirable locations from year to year within their lineage. So all the simulations that we had done in VEP1 and early VEP2 were really looking at the relationship between households and the resource landscapes they lived on. And another PhD student came along through WSU, Stephanie Crabtree, who you see down in lower right there, actually excavating in Mongolia. And working with her, we added a lot of behaviors that have to do more like with how communities interact with each other, the social dimensions of simulation. And what we're seeing here is the outline of groups. And I don't actually know where we are in these simulations. It's gotten kind of confused, but okay, the one on the left is already done. The one on the right is still running, and that's fine. You can just keep them going. The one on the left adds to the resource model that you saw running in as I began my talk. It adds to it that the social groups identify with each other and they claim agricultural land, and they play a sort of public goods game, that's the PG game, within the groups, and those groups that cooperate on that are able to wrest greater productivity from the landscape, and they grow. Well, we do know that groups were growing fast on this landscape from the 600s to the 1200s. And so that's something we wanted to build into a simulation. The simulation on the right-hand side is adding another dimension of behavior to the simulation on the left. And not only are households responding to resource distributions. Not only are they forming groups and not only are they playing a public goods game, but as they grow in size, they can also merge with other groups or perhaps fight other groups. And then there's a sort of hierarchy of groups that forms. And the blue lines here on the right-hand side are showing the group boundaries as a result of all those dynamics. And one thing you can easily see, even though the simulations aren't running properly, is that the groups in the right-hand simulation form much larger groups than the groups in the left-hand side. And so we looked at, with using that information, then we also did some statistical work to compare expectations based on these simulations with what we saw of kiva sizes that had been tabulated by Susan Ryan in her dissertations, great kiva size that had been tabulated by Susan Ryan in her dissertation at University of Arizona, and also settlement sizes. And there were suggestions that I can't really go into, please read this article, that the model on the right fits the data that we have available to us much better than the model on the left. And because the model on the right makes really expansive groups, we also were able to suggest that when we see really expansive groups in the Southwest, like in the Chaco regional system, that those may emerge and grow as a result of the dynamics that we were studying in the simulation on the right. Okay, next slide. The final derived VEP2 study I want to talk about is one that was led by Laura Ellison. And Laura looked at the distribution of house sizes, contemporaneous distribution of house sizes in these 4 areas of the Southwest. And the bigger circles simply indicate areas where we have more houses to study, and smaller circles, fewer houses. And plotted the distribution of sizes of houses through time. Now, why on earth would you want to do something like that? Well, she thought, and I certainly agree, that the size of your house has something to do with the degree of social prominence that you have. Now, it may be an indicator of wealth. It may be an indicator of your position in the ceremonial network. It may be partly an indication of how many kids you have. All those things are aspects of social prominence and in some cases aspects of wealth. So next slide. She looked at how the distribution of house sizes changes through time in each of those 4 areas. And she used the distribution to create something called a Gini coefficient, which is something that economists use to study wealth and income today. And basically, when studying house size distributions, when the Gini coefficient is very low, that means that all the houses are the same size. When the Gini coefficient is very high and can go up to almost 1, that means that a few houses are much larger and most of the houses are very small. You can see that for the Central Mesa Verde area, there's a big increase around 1100, then a decrease, and then a little bit of an increase again. Next slide. Here's the situation for Chaco. Chaco, of course, is dramatically different, beginning in the mid-800s when they begin to develop great houses. And as great houses develop, at the same time, there were also people living in small houses. And so the Gini coefficient is, as a result, large. That decreases through time, and eventually in the mid-1100s, that Chaco Canyon gets more or less depopulated. Next slide. This is what we see for the Middle San Juan. It actually, interestingly, starts out pretty high and then decreases, then has an increase in the mid-1100s when portions of the Chaco system get reoriented to the Middle San Juan. Next slide. And then here's what's happening in the Chuscas. Chuscas also start out pretty high and then decline and stay fairly low after that. If we throw everything into the same barrel, next slide, and look at the Gini coefficients for the entire northern region, we see they start out pretty high, then they decrease on into Pueblo 1, then they have a big increase in Pueblo 2, and then they decrease late in time. Those late decreases in the 1200s are probably at least in part related to the deteriorating climates in the 1200s. And if households can't produce a surplus, they can't be unequal. And so that's probably part of the explanation for the late decrease. Okay, next slide. Well, we've come a long ways in this from trying to find our feet in the DAP to going to the transition into Crow Canyon, and then how Crow Canyon proposed with other researchers to construct the VEP, which was built on DAP and Crow Canyon contributions and personnel. And what I take from this is that we learn a lot if we think big and we go beyond sites and beyond single time periods, think about large scale processes, long time periods. And when we can use things like the Gini coefficient that resonate with current people, that's a way of including the present in our reconstructions of the past. So large scale archaeology like this, I think, must involve multi-institutional long-term commitments and long-term funding. And the trajectory from the DAP to Crow Canyon or on into VAP has been able to leverage all those ingredients. And one thing you see that I'm mulling on right now at these larger scales for the Northern Southwest, we see these kind of long-term cyclic patterns often emerging. And we saw these in the DAP, but when you see it and it's just one-off, you can't think, how likely is it that we're seeing these same cycles in other areas? But as we scale up to include the entire Northern Southwest, we can see that there are many kinds of cyclical behaviors that are repeating themselves at various scales throughout the Southwest, at least up until about 1300. We can't see these unless we do scale up. And so this is, and if we can't see them, we can't try to explain them. So this is useful work. Well, as closing comments, the VEP is sadly over, but the Research Institute at Crow Canyon was founded to continue this tradition of large-scale research, and we look forward to its contributions. Thank you all very much for sticking with us for a long presentation, and I think that's the end of the formal talk.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. It's been for me, it's been quite an exciting journey through this development of seeds of research being planted by the DAP, people trained by the DAP, then moved over to Crow Canyon, where many of the projects many of the problems that were initially analyzed by the DAP were pursued by Crow Canyon, which then spun off additional new projects. And finally, with the creation of the Research Institute at Crow Canyon, gained the ability, as Tim pointed out, to take on really large scale projects that involve large amounts of archaeological data from large areas that go beyond the scope of the DAP and original Crow Canyon coverage. So thanks for everything. It's been a great fun. Hope to more continue that. Well, I hope that continues in the future for me and the rest of us. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Did any of you want to, we're only about 42 minutes over. Did anyone want to address any of the questions verbally in the Q&A? Or
can you get credit for 2 webinars?
yes, absolutely, absolutely. Taylor will send you a certificate. Looks like folks are dropping off. So thank you so much to our presenters, and thank you to everyone who watched. And if you did not get an answer to your question, I know that Taylor will make sure someone emails you. So thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Liz. Good to see you all.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah,
Okay,
bye.
bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.